History rarely collapses with a scream. It collapses with a shrug. While the world is fixated on bombs and borders in Ukraine, a quieter rupture is spreading beneath the ice. In Greenland, far from the noise of war, the idea of Western unity is being stress-tested. This is not a land dispute. It is a loyalty crisis. When Donald Trump pressures Denmark, he is not bargaining for territory. He is redefining what alliance means in an age of raw power. For Russia, this moment feels almost surreal. For decades, Moscow tried to weaken NATO from the outside. Now the pressure is coming from within. But here is the danger. Chaos does not automatically benefit those who wait. Vladimir Putin expected clarity, a deal on Ukraine, a reset, a reward for patience. Instead, he got unpredictability. If you want to understand how global orders erode before anyone dares to name the collapse, stay with me. Because what begins in the Arctic never ends there. And before we go further, we need to define the real problem. What exactly is the problem here? It is not Greenland, and it is not even Donald Trump. The real issue is structural. For 70 years, the Western alliance rested on one assumption: that American power was predictable, that U.S. leadership came with restraint. That assumption is now gone. Trump's second term has forced Europe to confront a question it avoided for decades. What happens when the security guarantor becomes a negotiator? For Russia, this shift matters deeply, because Moscow does not need NATO to collapse overnight. It only needs doubt to spread. Doubt slows decisions. Doubt fractures unity. Doubt weakens deterrence. And yet, the Kremlin faces its own dilemma. This uncertainty also makes Washington harder to manage. No clear red lines, no clear bargains, no reliable timetable. So what we are witnessing is not a simple power play. It is a collision of expectations between an alliance built on trust and a system drifting toward transactions. To understand how we arrived here, we have to go back. Not to this crisis, but to its origins. To understand this moment, we need to step back. Not years, decades. After the Cold War, the West assumed history had chosen a direction. Markets would integrate. Borders would soften. Security would be managed, not contested. Russia was folded into this vision, not as an equal, but as a problem that would slowly dissolve. That never happened. Instead, Moscow learned a different lesson. Power does not disappear. It relocates. NATO expanded eastward. Trust narrowed. Resentment hardened into strategy. By the time Vladimir Putin consolidated power, the goal was no longer integration. It was leverage. Not confrontation, but pressure. Undermine cohesion. Exploit hesitation. Wait for fractures. For years, that approach failed. Until unpredictability entered the system. When alliances stop feeling permanent, history speeds up. And once that happens, small crises stop being small. The first real shock came sooner than anyone expected. The first shock did not come with tanks. It came with disbelief. When Greenland entered the conversation, many treated it as a provocation, a bluff, a distraction. It was neither. For Europe, it was a moment of recognition. If this could be questioned, then everything could be questioned. Security guarantees, red lines, commitments made in calmer decades. For Russia, this was a signal, not of collapse, but of hesitation. Moscow understood the pattern immediately. Alliances do not break when attacked. They break when members stop trusting the rules. And yet the Kremlin did not celebrate, because confusion cuts both ways. A distracted alliance is weaker, but an unpredictable United States is harder to manage. If you think this crisis was about geography, you are missing the point. This was the moment uncertainty became policy, and once that happens, the system begins to reveal its hidden mechanics. That is where the real story starts. Beneath the headlines, there is a quieter machine at work. It runs on perception, on expectation, on timing. Power today is not only about armies, it is about predictability. For decades, NATO functioned because everyone knew the script. Who would respond? How fast? At what cost? Trump disrupted that script, not by withdrawing troops, not by tearing up treaties, but by introducing doubt into every calculation. For Russia, this mechanism is familiar. Moscow has always understood that hesitation is a force multiplier. But here is the catch. This system only works when the disruptor is consistent, when uncertainty is controlled. Trump's second-term foreign policy is not controlled uncertainty. It is volatile uncertainty. That changes everything. Because it doesn't just weaken alliances, it also scrambles adversaries' plans. Strategies built on patience begin to fray, timelines collapse, assumptions fail. This is why the Kremlin stays cautious, silent, observant. Because when the machinery of order starts misfiring, no one knows who gets crushed first. And the pressure was about to surface again. The second surge came fast, and it came from unexpected directions. Not from Europe, not from the Arctic, but from places where Russia once felt secure. In the Middle East, the balance shifted. Influence that took years to build was suddenly diluted. Decisions were made without Moscow in the room. In the South Caucasus, mediation slipped away. Other actors stepped in. Russia watched its role shrink. Then came the signal events. A Russian partner detained. A Russian-flagged tanker seized. Pressure reapplied on old allies. Each move on its own looked manageable. Together, they formed a pattern. This was not chaos. It was reassertion. Trump's unpredictability had a second edge. It did not just unsettle allies. It disrupted Russia's expectation of accommodation. No reset, no grand bargain, no immunity for old assumptions. For the Kremlin, this was the realization. Waiting was no longer cost-free. The system was tightening, and the next pressure point was closer to home. Now let me bring this closer to you, because this is not an abstract game. It is not a chessboard far away. When alliances wobble, the cost does not stay at the top. It moves downward. It shows up in energy prices, in inflation, in the sense that the world feels less stable than it did yesterday. You feel it when uncertainty becomes normal, when rules feel temporary, when tomorrow looks harder to plan. This is what strategic doubt does. It doesn't explode, it leaks. For people living under pressure, uncertainty is not theory. And that is why this moment matters. Because when great powers improvise, ordinary people absorb the shock. If you want to understand why your future feels less predictable, why security sounds conditional, this is where it begins. Stay with me, because the consequences do not stop at borders. They ripple outward. And the next wave is global. Once uncertainty escapes its origin, it does not stay local. It spreads. What began as a dispute inside the Atlantic Alliance quickly reshakes calculations far beyond Europe. In Asia, partners watch closely, not for statements, but for patterns. They ask a simple question: is commitment still automatic, or is it now negotiable? In the global South, the signal is different. Power looks less moral, more transactional. That opens space for hedging, for non-alignment, for deals made without loyalty. For China, this moment is instructive, not because Russia is rising, but because the West looks divided, and division changes risk. Markets respond. Supply chains adapt. Security planning becomes provisional. This is how geopolitical shocks multiply. Not through conquest, but through recalculation. Every actor revises assumptions. Every system slows. The world does not choose sides overnight. It drifts. And drifting in geopolitics is how order erodes. To see where this leads, we have to look ahead. Not at one future, but several. From here, the future splits. Not into one path, but three. The first is stabilization. The alliance absorbs the shock. Europe adapts. The United States recalibrates. Uncertainty becomes managed again. Rules return, slightly altered, but intact. Russia gains little. China learns limits. Order survives. The second path is drift. No collapse, no repair. Alliances exist, but confidence thins. Commitments are questioned quietly. Every decision takes longer. Russia exploits openings, but never secures a decisive win. The world becomes slower, more cautious, more transactional. Then there is the third future, fragmentation. Trust erodes faster than institutions can respond. Security becomes conditional. Power becomes personal. In that world, crises multiply because no one believes restraint will hold. History accelerates. Which future we enter depends on one variable, not strength, not ideology, but credibility. And credibility, once damaged, is the hardest thing to restore. All that remains is the final question. Every global order ends the same way, not with conquest, but with disbelief. People realize too late that the rules they trusted were never automatic. They were maintained. What you are witnessing now is not the collapse of an alliance. It is the exposure of its foundations. Greenland was not the cause. It was the mirror. For Russia, patience remains the strategy. For Europe, adaptation is no longer optional. For the United States, credibility has become the currency. And for you, this moment carries a choice. You can treat geopolitics as distant noise, or you can recognize the pattern. Because systems do not warn before they fail. They normalize instability. If this conversation made you see the world differently, stay with me. Subscribe. Share this with someone who still believes order is permanent. In the next video, we will examine what happens when uncertainty becomes the new normal. Because once that line is crossed, there is no return to the old world.